That moves us to number 11 on our action agenda, action as necessary or appropriate on matters discussed in executive session. Do I have a motion? Mr. Hogan.
I'd like to make the motion that we approve selected employment items shown in Exhibit A for action.
Do I have a second?
Second.
Ms. Snipes, any discussion? I'll call for the vote. All in favor? That motion carries 7-0. The next item on the agenda is the approval of the district's legal services for the fiscal year 2023-2024 in Exhibit C.
Madam Chairman of the Board, as our CFO, Madison Pohl, comes to the lectern, we present the legal services. We have two lists. One outlines the firms, and the other one outlines the attorneys that are listed per the policy. So, Ms. Pohl.
Thank you, Dr. Ross. Good evening again. As Dr. Ross mentioned, we do have two lists before you. Board Policy BDG governs board attorney/legal services. This policy states that the board will evaluate and approve this list at least annually. Based on the discussion at the last meeting, the request was to include all of the attorneys that the district may work with in the new fiscal year, as well as their Martindale-Hubbell ratings. So that you'll see that as your second attachment. The first one is, again, the same list that you had the last time. These were the attorney firms that we used in FY 22-23, and their different topics that we used them for. And then the second attachment will be actually the different attorneys within the firm that we could potentially use in FY 24, as well as their Martindale-Hubbell ratings. I do want to just mention that, based on the research that we have done, there are several attorneys that do not have a Martindale-Hubbell rating, and those are also noted on your sheet as well. So at this time, the administration would just recommend the approval of the firms on the second listing as stated.
Thank you, Ms. Paul. Do we have any comments or questions? Do I have a motion?
I move that we approve the list of attorneys per the second list of Exhibit C.
Do I have a second? Ms. Snipes. Any more discussion since I asked for discussion before the motion? Sorry. All right, Mr. Scully.
Yeah, real quick question. So when we approve the firms, on the second page, the attorneys listed specifically are the only ones that we can use from those firms?
Correct. Yes, sir.
Okay.
All right, any more questions? I will call for the vote. All in favor of Ms. Huddle's motion? All opposed? And Mr. Hogan stepped out, so he abstained. So that motion carries 6-0. And that moves us to number 13, the first reading approval of proposed revisions to board policy GCQE, retirement of professional staff, Exhibit D.
If it pleases the board, we would like to handle, both of these policies are very similar, so while it may take two motions, we will explain them together if you're...
Okay, and that would go with 14, first reading approval of proposed revisions to board policy GDQC, retirement of support staff. And I can ask for a motion if you want before to combine.
Dr. Wicker, you want to explain?
Go ahead.
Yeah,
Okay.
just real quick.
Okay.
The discussion took place last time. First of all, good evening, Madam Chair, members of the board, Dr. Ross. Discussion took place last board meeting in regards to board policy GCQE, retirement of professional staff, and GDQC, retirement of support staff, to correct outdated eligibility requirements as it pertains to TERI, Teacher and Employee Retention Incentive Program. It's recommendation of the administration that the board approve the first reading of the proposed revisions to board policy GCQE and GDQC and proceed to the second and final reading at the August 7th, 2023 board meeting.
All right, do I have a motion? Okay, Mrs. Huddle.
I move, do you want them combined or separate? Combined?
I think it's easier to combine them.
I move that we approve first reading of proposed revisions to board policy GCQE, retirement of professional staff, and policy GDQC, retirement of support staff.
And do I have a second? Ms. Barnhart. Any discussion? Seeing none, I'll call for the vote. All in favor? And that vote carries 7-0. Thank you, Dr. Wicker.
Thank you.
And that moves us to number 15 on the action agenda, approval of establishing a procurement review panel, Exhibit F.
I would ask that Ms. Madison Paul come forward as she comes to the lectern. I want to outline that this procurement review panel is required through our procurement policy. So, Ms. Paul, if you can kind of share what brings this before the board.
Yes, sir, absolutely. So if y'all recall at the last board meeting, we did talk about the procurement review panel, and as it is presented in our procurement code. It is in section 4410, labeled procurement review panel, and it's part of the SC code, chapter 11-35-4410. So basically what this states is that the district does need to create a procurement review panel. As part of this panel, that they will review requests for written determinations by the chief business official pursuant to just sections 4210, which is in relation to the right to protest, 4220, which is in relation to the authority to debar or suspend, and also 4230, which is in relation to the authority to resolve contract and breach of contract controversies. So each of these items would be written determinations that would be made by myself as the chief business official. Within 15 days, if there are requests for review of that, the committee would then need to convene to review these requests. And at that time, the panel would then be formed to be able to review the request. The panel is made up of one member of the board that would chair the panel. This would be a vote by the Board of Trustees. And then the other 4 members of this panel would be appointed one by the board chair, one by the board vice chair, one by the superintendent, and one by myself. So at that time, there would be 5 members of this board. And again, it would only convene as necessary throughout the year, and that the members would serve from July 1 through June 30th annually and could be reappointed each year if they so choose. So at this time, we would recommend that the board decide on a procurement panel chair as a member of the board. And then if that is decided, I would request that each of you as members to appoint would just send your appointed member to me in writing.
That sounds good. So that means that we need a motion, or we don't need a motion, we need nominations from the floor for a chair. Ms. Snipes?
I nominate Kevin Scully to chair the procurement review panel.
Do I have any others? Ms. Huddle?
I nominate Matt Hogan to chair the procurement review panel.
Do we have any others? So we will, so we're going to do a voice. Yes, Mr. Hogan.
Ms. Paul, just clarification, would I be able to serve as chair with an appointment of a selected position on this committee?
Yeah, so I looked into that in the code. It does not address that
Okay.
specific incident. So I do not see anything that would preclude you from serving in that role.
Got it.
Yes, sir.
Right, and that's because, and I think Mr. Hogan is saying that because as chair and vice chair, we both have appointment powers, and then the superintendent and the CFO have appointment powers for that position. So I'm going to call for a voice vote on that. So all in favor of Mr. Scully, raise your hand. And all in favor of Mr. Hogan. All right, so Mr. Scully has been appointed as the chair of the procurement panel for the next year. All right, thank you. Thank you. All right, that moves us to the discussion agenda. Number 16, audit services update, Manley Garvin auditing process.
I invite Ms. Paul to come and introduce our guests.
Good evening, thank you. I do have the pleasure of introducing Mr. Josh Garvin and Mr. Luke Vickery here from Manley Garvin tonight. They're going to give you just a brief update of where they are in the audit process, where they're going for us, and a timeline of what this audit process will look like. So I'll invite them to come forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Paul, and appreciate the opportunity to be in front of you tonight, board members. Again, my name is Josh Garvin. I am the shareholder and CEO of the firm Manley Garvin out of Greenwood, South Carolina. We're here tonight just to kind of give you a brief introduction to ourselves. Along with myself, I have Luke Vickery, who's the senior manager on the engagement. He'll be leading the day-to-day operations of the firm. as it relates to the, again, to the day-to-day audit process itself. Am I giving you the finger? There we go. All right. So who is Manley Garvin? Manley Garvin is a full-service accounting firm residing in Greenwood, South Carolina. We were founded in 2015, but have a much more robust history related to that. We were actually part of a much larger firm, Elliott Davis, which you may have heard of. We were the Greenwood office of Elliott Davis from 1955 through 2015. 2015, we had an opportunity to branch out on our own, purchase the practice from Elliott Davis, still remain good friends with those guys and refer work back and forth. But that's kind of our history. We forged our own path. We're proud of where we are. We specialize in governmental auditing. So based on our experience with Elliott Davis, the only thing we audit are governmental entities and not-for-profits. So we do that. I won't read to you, but we've got about 25 folks in the office, 2 shareholders, myself and Jim Manley. Next. Talked a little bit about the audit team already. Myself will be leading as the shareholder. Luke will be an engagement lead as the senior manager. And then we have 3 other professional staff who will be intimately involved in the audit process. This particular engagement team has over 65 years of audit experience with local school districts. So we know what we're doing. Next. Timeline. Interim testing. Obviously, this kind of came at us fast. And so we were mindful of that, mindful of the size of the engagement, the complexity of the engagement. So as soon as we were provided a signed engagement letter, we hit the ground running, understanding that we were already a little behind the 8 ball. So our team has completed the interim testing. We've gotten to where we want to be. We're still working vehemently behind the scenes to get things prepared for the actual year-end audit processes. You'll see the timeline there. We're looking to do that in the September, October, November timeframe with a draft of the financial statements to management by November the 20th and issue before the November 30th. Going forward in future years, we'd like to accelerate that time frame. That is our objective. Again, this kind of came at us fast, and we wanted to step in and help the district. So we expect it to drag a little bit this year, but going forward, we expect that again to be accelerated into a more appropriate time frame. Next, what have we done so far? We've set our file up. We've worked with Ms. Paul's team to get everything pulled in as far as trial balances and financial statements. Templates are being prepared. Again, that's kind of the stuff that's going on behind the scenes. Our audit process, as you know, is based on a risk-based model. That's how the auditing procedures require us to do it. So we've gone through our risk assessments and know where we're going to concentrate our efforts. You'll hear me say this at the conclusion of the audit process, as well as we talk to you board members specifically. We do not audit every single transaction. If we audited every single transaction, we'd be sitting over there with Ms. Paul and her team. So it is a risk-based audit process, and one where materiality comes into effect. We're not going to audit every single transaction, as I've said. So just be mindful of that as we go through the audit process. And again, I've mentioned board member inquiries. Part of our planning process is that we have conversations with various board members. We've taken the approach, given the size of the district as well as what's going on here, that with a first-year engagement, that in our first-year engagements, we always talk to every board member. So if you haven't been contacted by Luke or one of our team members thus far, you can expect that conversation to happen sooner rather than later. Expectations of administration and the board. So administration, management is responsible for ensuring the accounting records are complete and accurate. We're responsible as your external auditors to come in and audit those transactions and audit those financial statements. Most people in the public assume that goes the other way, that we come in and we prepare your financial statements, we audit everything. That's actually the opposite. So management's responsible for getting those financial statements pulled together, complete and accurate. We come in and we audit those. Management's responsible for providing the information that we request for during the audit process. We do help pull the financial statements together, but that's done through a process of the information that you have provided. At the conclusion of the audit process prior to issuance, we provide a draft, management reviews and approves that draft prior to issuance. What do you do in your board capacity? You have the fiduciary responsibility to the district, as you know. and you have to evaluate the independence of the auditor. And so obviously, with a signed engagement letter, you guys have been through that process. One thing I always like to mention is that in your board capacity, you have open and honest conversations with us as external auditors. You're going to have our contact information. You have the ability and the right to reach out to us as your external auditors at any time. We welcome that conversation, so feel free to do that as needed. And really, that's the long and the short of it. Again, we're Manley Garvin. We're here to help. We're excited about partnering with the district. We're just up the road, and look forward to helping you guys get through this audit process. Anything else?
Thank you. Do I have any questions or comments from the board? Mr. Satterfield?
I had a brief commentary from Mr. Vickery. I want you to put a name and a face together. I did try to get back in touch with you, but you were out of the country. I appreciate you getting in touch with us in such a timely fashion, but I apologize. Thank you, sir.
Do I have anything else? All right, thank you very much. And that moves us to item 17 on the discussion agenda, discussion of board policy DFAB, reserve funds, Exhibit G.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the board. We're going to toggle between board policy DB, annual budget, and board policy IB with your permission. Reserve funds and DFAB, reserve funds and DB, annual budget. I want to ask Ms. Madison Paul, our CFO, to come forth. We have Jay Glover from our financial advisor, glad to hear, and on the call, we have our bond attorney, Ms. Franny Hauser, here to answer any questions. So I'll turn it over to Ms. Paul.
Thank you, Dr. Ross. As he mentioned, so first up on the agenda is policy DFAB, which is regarding reserve funds. So we did ask Mr. Jay Glover and Ms. Franny Heiser to be here tonight to give a presentation about the importance of reserve funds. We also may, just in this discussion, move a little bit into policy DB, annual budget, because there is a section in that policy that also talks about reserve funds. So I will invite Jay Glover up to speak on his behalf. Thank you.
Thanks, Ms. Paul. Madam Chair, Dr. Ross, school board members, Jay Glover from PFM Financial Advisors, the district's financial advisor. And I am here to talk about credit ratings in the context of fund balance, because there's many elements of a fund balance, but as your financial advisors who helps you access the capital markets when there's a need to fund capital projects, credit ratings are a very important part of that. And fund balance, quite frankly, is, if not the most important, one of the most important elements of maintaining a high credit rating. So next slide here, please. The first bullet, and I hope you all can see that, really the first bullet just restates the fund balance policy itself. And you will see in there that one of the reasons you strive to maintain a strong fund balance is to stay in that AA, AA2 rating category, which is actually consistent with what your current credit ratings are, which we'll talk about on the next slide. Reasons why you need to have a strong fund balance. Really, the number one reason is because it's there for unforeseen circumstances. There's always the potential for things to happen and for the district to need funds on a moment's notice, whether that's some type of natural disaster that might happen, whether that's some type of litigation. There's a need to be able to access cash on a pretty immediate basis to fund needs that are unforeseen. There's also the element of cash flow within a school district, whereby when your fiscal year starts, you obviously start spending money, but the bulk of your revenues don't come in until later in the year when taxes start coming in. So while your fund balance per your financial statement is sort of a snapshot in time at the end of your fiscal year, that fund balance fluctuates significantly throughout the year as you spend money compared to when actual revenues come in. And I know Ms. Paul has a graphic after my presentation that speaks to that. Many school districts that do not have strong reserves actually have to issue what's called tax anticipation notes. So that's actually going out to the capital markets and accessing funds that allow you to bridge that gap between when revenues come in and expenditures are made. So given your strong fund balance, you can actually internally finance that difference, and you don't have to access the outside capital markets to do so. That's just a little bit of why a fund balance is important. The next two slides really talk about the credit rating process and the importance fund balance has on that credit rating process. So here on the next, actually it's up. On the next slide here, you can see your current credit ratings again. You all are rated AA2 by Moody's and AA by S&P. Those are two of the three major rating agencies that look at your credit on an annual basis and assign a credit rating. And I'll tell you, those credit ratings are in the upper echelon of where school districts get rated around the country. And in South Carolina, there's only maybe one or two that have credit ratings higher than that, which would be AA1, AA+. And just given the nature of a school district and how the finances works, it's very difficult to get credit ratings higher than what you have now. So you should be very proud of the decisions made to maintain those credit ratings, and it allows you to access the capital markets at an effective cost of capital when you do fund capital needs. The next three bullets just talk a little bit about the rationale that was provided in the most recent credit rating report from Moody's. So these are not things that I'm pointing out. These are actually things that are excerpted right from their report. So the rationale for why you have a strong AA2 credit rating from Moody's, you see here in these four sub-bullets: favorable location within South Carolina's capital region, strong resident income levels, solid, stable financial position, which is really related to fund balance and refers to the ability to have structural balance. So what I mean by structural balance is you generate revenues each year to cover your recurring expenses. So you're not using fund balance to cover budget shortfalls and pay recurring expenses. And then the final thing is long-term liabilities that are slightly higher than comparable rated school districts. And we'll get into that a little bit on the next page as to why Moody's is saying your leverage metrics are slightly higher than other rated school districts. Again, here, just pointing what I mentioned before, factors that could lead to an upgrade. Lower long-term liabilities, which are really pension focused, which we'll talk about on the next page, and then improvement in fund balance and liquidity levels. So it's really a big driver of fund balance, and maybe even more importantly for this discussion is the factors that could lead to a downgrade, being material decline in fund balance and liquidity. So obviously, as I mentioned, and we'll show this on the next slide if I can see it, the importance of that fund balance in the credit rating process. So, and I apologize in advance, this is getting a little bit into the weeds. It's hard to talk about credit ratings and financial positions without getting a little bit into the weeds, but I do want to try to keep this as high level as possible. As you see here on the second bullet, Moody's has a scorecard process they go through, so it's a very transparent rating process as to what goes into this scorecard. And there's really four factors that do so, and you'll see them here. Economy is 30% of their metrics, and what economy is broken down into is income levels, looks at the full value of your tax base, and it also looks at enrollment trends. They see a growing school district with a growing enrollment as having a strong economy. So those are the three sub-factors that go into 30% economy. Financial performance, again, is another 30% of the criteria, and I'll skip over that one real quick till I move to the next bullet. Institutional framework is 10% of the criteria, and every school district in the state of South Carolina has a AA institutional framework score, and that's just related to how you all are funded and the state's involvement in funding. So you really have no discretion over that metric. That's 10% of your score, and every school district gets that in South Carolina. And then the final metric is leverage, which is broken down into pension, debt, and OPEB liability. I mentioned before that they say in their report that your leverage metric is slightly higher than comparable rated school districts nationwide. And keep in mind, in this higher discussion, Moody's is looking at districts across the country and trying to provide comparability. So they look at things differently than you might look at them because they have to rate a school district in California, one in New York, one in Florida, one in South Carolina, and they want to do that on a comparable basis. So they actually are able to not only use this scorecard, but have other factors outside of the scorecard to offset those metrics. And one of those is leverage in the case of South Carolina, because a lot of your leverage metric is made up of your pension cost, over half of it. And as you all know, that is funded largely by the state in South Carolina, which is an offsetting factor that a high leverage levels in that the state funds that cost. So while that metric looks a little off per se in their rating scorecard, they do note that that's somewhat offset by the fact that the state funds those costs. So that's just one example of another factor that goes into the rating outside of the criteria. It's not like that in some states. So they're allowed to make adjustments based on that. But getting back to the financial performance ratio, which is really what we're talking about here in terms of fund balance, it's broken down into two categories. That is available fund balance is 20% of the score, and then your liquidity ratios is 10%. So again, that 20% mark for fund balance is the one highest category of the whole 100% of your credit rating score. So it's very important. And Moody's looks at available fund balance ratio and compares that to operating revenues. So, and they do include assigned, unassigned, and committed fund balances in their ratio. Again, that is different than what the school district might look at in terms of how they fund their fund balance, because they're, again, looking at that across all comparable school districts in the country. And they actually set their benchmarks higher in terms of a ratio because they include some funds that might be committed in that calculation. So you can see here, and I guess that's about the fifth bullet down, where fund balance ratios fall in terms of Moody's scorecard within that subsection. So a district that has a fund balance ratio of greater than or equal to 25% would be considered to have a AAA score within that one segment. 17.5% to 25% would be considered a AA score within the fund balance criteria, and 10 to 17.5% would equate to an A score within that criteria. So again, within that one criteria, that shows you how Moody's looks at it from a fund balance perspective. So if you had a lower fund balance score, you would have to have a higher score in some other category to offset that in order not to potentially get a rating downgrade. So again, just gives you some context into what Moody's looks at. Again, I'll mention all fund balances are not sort of, kind of created equal. Everybody looks at it a little bit differently. If you ask S&P or Fitch, who are the other rating agencies, they might have a slight twist on it as well. What they include, what they don't include, what they actually compare it to. Is it revenues? Is it expenditures? But I think the point of my presentation today is not necessarily to make a policy decision on your behalf about where fund balance needs to be, but just make you aware of the importance of it, especially when it comes to credit ratings. The district has to access the capital markets on an annual basis to fund its capital needs. I know there's talk about a referendum, which would require a longer-term debt issuance. Having the strongest credit ratings possible, in particular if you're going to access the capital markets for long-term debt, is really going to obviously limit your cost of capital and allow you to create more funds based on your target debt service millage ratio. So again, I think Ms. Paul has some information about the fluctuations in fund balance as we move throughout the year that she's going to discuss, but I'm also happy to answer any questions you all might have about credit rating impacts or any other element of fund balance that might be helpful as you all have this discussion about your policy.
Okay, do I have any questions for Ms. Tuttle?
Yeah, several questions. As you said, Moody's uses the assigned, unassigned, and committed. Do you know, based on their scoring, because we've been looking at undesignated, which is very different. If we were to calculate, or how did they calculate, do we know where we fall on that?
I do. I actually
Okay.
have a breakdown of the scorecard, and they show your fund balance, the way they calculate it, at about 23%.
Okay.
So it falls within, as I mentioned, that AA category range. So it includes more, thus it's a higher percentage.
Okay. And so a follow-up question is, and I know you can't promise this, but I mean, in your professional judgment, if we were to get AAA, how likely is it that it would improve our rating? Because we can't go, we're already real high.
Yeah, I know. Obviously getting a fund balance above 25% is a difficult thing to do, and I don't necessarily know that in and of itself would move you from the AA2 category to the say, AA1 category. There's no school districts in South Carolina, and quite frankly, none in the country that I'm aware of. I'm sure there are, I shouldn't say that on the record, but there's very few that would ever achieve the AAA rating. I mean, you see a lot of cities and counties that have that type of credit rating, but not a school district. So, I was kind of a roundabout answer, but, the importance is sort of maintaining that fund balance at its levels. I think you should strive to kind of keep your credit ratings where they are now. I think making decisions to try to get a higher credit rating might be going against some other things you're trying to do to spend funds to educate kids.
And then my last question, at what, do they measure your average or once a year? At what point do they measure and how do they
Yeah,
measure?
so they're basing it off of audited financial statements. So, they're looking at it on your case on a 6/30 fiscal year end basis. And that's one of the reasons they want the ratio to be higher, is because they know that that is a snapshot in time. There are points in times where your fund balance ratio was much higher than that after you get, revenues in, and it's times when it's much lower than that, after you're having expenditures and things. So it is a snapshot in time. If I might, just one more thing that's very important that I meant to mention. If there ever is a need to spend fund balance, it needs to be spent on one-time expenditures. I think where you really get into trouble with rating agencies is when you're using fund balance to cover recurring expenses, because using fund balance is a one-time thing, and if you're using it to pay recurring expenses, you're going to continue to bleed your fund balance year over year. So there are districts and cities and counties, if you do build up excess funds, you can draw it down for a one-time need. They don't want what I used the term structural balance before. They don't want you to use your fund balance to fill a gap that's recurring each year, that structural imbalance, and that's when you start getting downgrades talked about.
Okay. Anyone else have any questions for Mr. Glover? Ms. Huddle.
Speaking of that structural imbalance, even though they would be one-time projects, if you, on a recurring basis, pull fund balance for construction, would that concern them?
Well,
Even if they're separate projects?
Yeah, we're talking two different things, because we're talking more operating funds in terms of fund balance versus capital, so it's really two different things. I don't think most of the funds that are in your fund balance can be used for capital needs. I think we're talking more operating purposes.
Well, we
here.
have voted from time to time to pull fund balance for a construction project.
Yeah, if
So I
you
just
do
want to
that,
make
yeah.
sure
Yeah,
Moody's
no,
wouldn't.
if that's a one-time, I would say capital projects are one-time needs, yeah. Or if you're funding, one-time expenses, just not like, we talk a lot about teachers today. You don't want to give raises based off spending a fund balance. I know you might want to give raises, but then what do you do the next year? Because that fund balance can only be spent once,
Could you give a bonus, a one-time bonus?
a one-time.
Okay, one time. Never do it again. No, just kidding.
All right, anyone else? Okay, thank you, Mr. Glover, and just, if there's some questions that come up, we'll call you back up again. Okay, thank you. Ms. Paul?
Thank you. I think Rachel's getting my side. I just, as we talk about cash flow and fund balance throughout the year, of course, our audited financials, our fiscal year ends 6/30. So that is the snapshot in time that our auditors will look at. So at 6/30 of 22, which is the last year that we have audited, our unassigned fund balance was 38.4 million, which was right at 18% of our budgeted expenditures for the new fiscal year. But what I wanted to review is what this looks like over time. So we did start from a calendar year because that's really more of how our revenues are collected. So you can see, this again is just the calendar year of 22 because we don't have a full year for 23 currently. But at really, January 1st of 2022, we're looking at about a $39.4 million fund balance, unassigned fund balance for the district. If I look at I have three different lines here. The red one is the state requirement, because by state statute 5920-90, we have to have 1 month of operating expenditures on hand, or we fall into that fiscal watch category that can be designated by the state superintendent of education. The second, the green line, is looking at what Jay just went over, the AA requirement. So that's really that 2 months of operating expenditures. So kind of looking at those two lines, for us, about $17 million. And again, this is looking at last calendar year, but it's about $17 million is 1 month. So 2 months is about $34 million. Would be our AA rating. So if you look at this kind of, again, over time, we definitely have a spike in January 31st. That's, taxes are due January 15th. So we certainly have a spike in fund balance at that time. In January of 22 went up to about 63 million, but you see that it steadily declines over the calendar year. So again, at that June 30th year end mark, we were at 38.4 from our audited financials. But in November of 22, which is really November 30th of 22, that's really our lowest point throughout the year. We were at 20.2 million, which is really just above that state requirement line. Again, we do bounce back pretty quickly. We do start getting some tier payments from the state. And then of course the property tax revenue does come in January. So we have a quick turnaround, but we definitely hit that low point that is very close to the state 1 month of operating expenses requirement. So just wanted to show that graphically for y'all as we talk about this discussion as well.
Okay, does anyone have any questions for Ms. Paul? Ms. Huddle?
Is the state's definition, it's not the same as Moody's, right?
It is not.
Is it just
It says undesignated.
undesignated? Thanks.
Any more questions? Mr. Scully?
Yeah, Ms. Paul, just to kind of summarize, I guess the big takeaway here is that not only is the fund balance important to us as a district from an operating standpoint to have money available and if we needed it, but it's a big component of our credit rating, which then impacts not only the availability of credit to us, but also the cost of credit. So not having a fund balance, I know it's often portrayed kind of publicly as we're just accumulating money that we don't need for the fund balance, and that's not what this is. It would actually be fiscally irresponsible for us to continually dip into that fund balance or to not carry as high a balance as we're recommending or as you recommend, as we can see how that impacts our credit rating and therefore our cost and availability of credit in the future. So I just want to summarize that.
Yes, sir. I would just say, as he mentioned before, we'd certainly get to that low point in November. And, if we get much lower than that, we would be into the situation where we would have to issue a tax anticipation note, which he mentioned would incur more interest costs for the district. It would be paid off quickly. It would be a short-term loan. But at the same time, that is something that we can avoid because we have the cash flow available to not have to issue that extra debt. Yes, sir.
Thank you. Anyone else? All right, thank you, Ms. Paul.
Thank you.
All right, so that moves us to items.
Ms. Hines?
Yes.
I was just wondering, it says discussion of board policy. So are we contemplating perhaps changing the
No.
board policy?
No, this recommendation was actually brought forth by the administration to discuss these policies at our last board officers meeting. And so that is why they were on this agenda, because the administration just wanted to give Dr. Ross, I'll let you.
Yeah, we wanted to show the position of the reserve. We do not recommend any change, but again, it's a board policy, so we are bringing it here, but we're sharing our position on why we want to keep the reserve policy as is.
I would just like to comment that I don't think our policy is consistent with the goals I heard here. I heard two overarching goals. One is fund balance for rating service to achieve a good rating. And the other I heard is the state's requirement for fund balance to avoid a fiscal watch and ensure we have enough reserves on hand. The problem with the current policy doesn't really address the rating service, because the way that the rating service calculates it is very different. And so they're two totally different things, in my opinion. So I would hope that we would address it and look at maybe having two goals in there. One, a cash flow goal that's based on the state's requirements, and a second, which is a rating service goal, which is based on the rating services requirements. And I would add into that a policy of what we're going to do if we exceed either of those two. Because the reality is, we have, over the last 3 years, spent a good deal of fund balance on construction projects. And so we have accumulated excess. We don't have it now because we took it out of fund balance. But at any rate, I would just ask that we look at that, and I think that's the safest thing, to guarantee that we meet the state's requirements, and as much as possible, guarantee that we meet the rating service requirements.
Okay. Mr. Satterfield?
Hey, just for clarification, Ms. Huddle, are you saying that you're in favor of passing or making a motion to incorporate?
There cannot be a motion here.
Well, I'm just asking, just philosophically, theoretically. But to maintain that whatever, when we go through the budget process, you're all in favor of making sure the fund balance is adequate so that we maintain a 2A, at a minimum, a 2A rating?
Yes, sir. I mean, and we can't make a motion tonight, but I really would, it's up to the officers to put items on the agenda, but I really would like to see us bring this back and put that in the policy, that our goal is to get the 2A rating, and that measurement of the 17 to 25%, and our goal is to meet the state's requirements, and we could even up that just to be on the safe side. And specifically what we're going to do if the projected fund balance is going to be over that. Because, for example, that would allow you to maybe not increase taxes as much as you otherwise would have to, or there are other things that you could do with it. But that, yes, I would like to see us put it on the agenda.
Okay. The reason I ask is I know that, is it still my turn?
Sure.
Thank you. I wanted to make sure, because we did have a lot of discussion about the budget, just for folks in the audience and those that might be watching. And I know that we talked about the fund balance, Dr. Ross, and I think the projection was making sure that it stayed at a minimum of 17.95 or 99, which is really at the low end. So I do like the idea of making sure that we maintain such a balance that our credit rating stays where it needs to be so that we can borrow money when we need to at a very good rate, which is being responsible. So, Dr. Ross, I don't know if you want to say anything
Dr.
about
Ross
that.
he was asking about it.
Yeah, I was just going to say to that point about it, we do have in board policy DB annual budget, one of those goals of maintaining the 2 months, and I think we would just add it in both places so that we could specifically outline that that's purpose is for the credit rating. So just want to make sure both of them are combined.
Well, and I think the point I was making is that the formula the credit rating agency uses is different. So I would like to see us include both formulas in the policy. When Ms. Paul goes over financials, we would see the results of both so that we're sure we're meeting both. Because they are different, it would be possible to meet one and not the other. And then the other is I really would like us to see, the policy says a range, but it doesn't say what happens if you go over that range. And I think we should address that in the policy as well.
Okay. Mr. Hogan?
With the, Ms. Paul, actually, question for you. With the district's financial rating, and while I understand it's incredibly important, does it play any bearing when we go to SCAGO for bonds, or does it have an impact when we go to the private market, or is there an area that I'm just not thinking about where our financial rating is going to have an impact?
I'm going to defer to Jay if that's okay for this question.
Yes, that's a great question. Again, Jay Glover from PFM. When you access the capital markets through SCAGO, your credit rating is obviously less important because it also has the state intercept program. But keep in mind, SCAGO is only available if you do a one-year financing. So like this year, we did a one-year note. We were able to use SCAGO. Where it becomes much more important in terms of your own credit rating is if you were to do a referendum and you had longer term debt. But so if you did a 10 or 15 year financing, it would be very important to have the strongest credit rating. But yeah, and to answer your kind of private debt market, doing bank loans and things like that, we often get the first question we ask is, does the district have a credit rating? Can we send that credit report? It's almost like the bank's credit officers takes comfort in looking at someone else's third-party opinion on the district's credit. So I think from a bank market, Yes, it helps get approval for transactions. Long-term debt, very important. SCAGO, not so much, but that's limited to only one-year financings.
All right, thank you very much. Did you have anything else? That moves us to the discussion items 19 and 20. I say that because it's very likely that these conversations may overlap a little bit, which is the discussion of board policy, IB academic freedom, and the discussion of IMB, teaching about controversial and sensitive issues. These items were placed on the agenda after our June 26th meeting. I had asked Dr. Ross to put these on the agenda, and Trustee Barnhart also asked these items to be discussed relating to the policies. The administration, I don't believe, has any recommendations, and this is really for us to be able to have a conversation about the subject matter that many of you are here tonight for, and that many folks at the last meeting were here for. So what I think is probably best is to I know Dr. Ross touched on academic freedom earlier, but to maybe discuss that a little bit and bring in IMB, which is teaching about controversial and sensitive issues, and then the board can discuss.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the board. We've talked about the academic freedom policy, and I want to spend a time just kind of sharing the board policy IMB, teaching about controversial, sensitive issues. And a lot of it has to relate to what we've talked about is providing the opportunity for our students to be able to have a wide range of perspectives about a particular topic. The question is, what is controversial? And that's where we get caught up with. And I think it was best said when it is defined by the community. It is when that person calls in. We have safety and security to some degree in the standards, and we have support documents. We have indicators that are used, recommended authors. But that doesn't mean that or preclude that any topic can be to one person controversial. So we believe that the best thing is that educators work with educators, the teachers work with the administrators, and if there are some issues that come about that are not explicitly written out in the standards or the support documents, that you can talk about that with your principal, and that's what the policy outlines. We look at 4 areas, and we've talked about this with our principals, about appropriateness to the course, the maturity of the students, the age group of the students, the approach to instruction, and then the teaching materials used. And so that is a decision that we put at the principal teacher level. And so that is how we address that. I will say this just to give some context. There's data posted in Education Week last week that says a teacher makes 1,500 decisions a day. That study came out pre-COVID. They have not done that study recently. 1,500 decisions a day of a teacher. And again, that's old data. And I will share that our teachers are doing an amazing job with 2,000 decisions every single day. But we prepare if there is a decision that someone disagrees with, that our policy allows that to be worked out with the teacher and the principal. So that's our position of this. We realize that controversial or sensitive issues will be discussed. That's debate, that's argument, that's rhetoric. We have that. But when these arise, we do have a policy and procedure around that. So I just wanted to offer that. Again, as with everything in academic freedom, Our policy establishes that the teacher's attitude is that of the true scholar. So we're presenting not the teacher's position, but multiple positions within the discussion so that the student can make their independent decisions and conclusions.
All right. And Ms. Barnhart, I know that you had called for a discussion of these policies, so I just wanted to let you go first if you have any thoughts or comments on these policies or what you,
I mean, as far as the policy goes, obviously, we're not here to change them in discussion. But again, with teaching controversial issues, I agree with everyone. I mean, they should be taught to children. However, you know, we should just ensure that when they are taught, they are taught in a way that abides our policy as well as state law. And that was just my first topic of discussion when it came to that.
okay. And I'll kind of also piggyback off of that because I also asked for this item to be pushed on the agenda. You know, I have been asked many times if we were going to discuss a CRT policy or anything to that effect in a school board meeting. And what I think that, and I don't want to be presumptuous, but I think that what folks may not understand is that there's not a CRT policy. So when we're looking at our policies about controversial materials and academic freedom, that is the most closely related policies that we have. You know, it's frustrating because there isn't like a model policy or anything to that effect, but the language that's important are contained in both of these policies, which is why I wanted to discuss that, because what is in these policies is that, you know, teachers are not trying to control this is what the policy requires, is that teachers aren't, you know, trying to control students' judgment, that you don't know where your teacher is coming from. I mean, Dr. Ross's commentary about, you know, knowing a teacher, you know, the students taking a bet on what their teacher's political ideology was. I mean, that's what, you know, in my opinion, what indicates a proper, you know, a good lesson, a good teacher, that you don't know and that a teacher is challenging you. And I think that these policies address that. Controversial materials as well. I mean, I think, in my opinion, it touches on all of this. I think where we get ourselves into trouble, and, you know, this is a very hard conversation to have right now because of what is going on externally and what the board can and cannot discuss. But, you know, where we get ourselves in trouble and where you see this disagreement amongst the community is the fact that there are situations where material is presented, I'm going to say allegedly, or where you hear situations where material is presented one-sided, or it's, you know, when you say that you're making a student feel uncomfortable, there's a difference between making a student feel uncomfortable and making a student feel like they are less than currently, or that they need to be apologetic. And you hear those conversations happening, and that is what gets parents upset. That's what gets teachers upset. But I mean, I'm saying that because that is the reality.
But Moms for Liberty says that.
So I'm not speaking for moms. No, okay. So first of all, you know, that you're out of order, ma'am. It's okay, but here's the thing. There is a small minority in any group. It doesn't matter if you're in a group about pig farmers and how pig farmers want to do one thing or another, and I'm saying that to be funny, but there is a minority in every single group that speaks loudly that does not speak for a group. And that's frustrating because then it's hard to have civil discourse. And that is what we're trying to do tonight, is to talk about these policies. I want to hear back from my fellow board members on, you know, what you think about these policies. What, you know, if we were to change them, what does that look like? And how does that fit current state law? How does that fit, policies relating to teachers? What are we thinking about? Because what happens is everybody goes out and speaks outwardly and not necessarily internally. And I'm not just talking about this board. I mean, you have the General Assembly is having conversations about material on controversial, or legislation on controversial material and CRT and all other topics. And they haven't perfected that either. So this isn't something that just like you just fix. So I'm sorry. Oh, okay. Well, I mean, my point is I'm going to say this. What is frustrating to me, and when I say that there's always different points of view, and we cannot talk about whatever it is that y'all, I know that there's folks that would want to talk about certain things, but sometimes what you hear is not what actually happened. So I think that happens on all sides. I think I heard things last week where things, were said that I don't believe that are true. I believe the same thing happened tonight. And so I'm saying all of that to open up conversation and dialogue with the board. And I'm going to turn that over to Trustee Snipes, please.
In immediate response to what our thoughts are on the policies, I think the policies are fine. I think generally where we have gone wrong, and I don't mean we specifically, the board, I mean we as a community, is back to when Dr. Ross gave his superintendent's report, and he shared the story of, the process that he went through when he did not agree with the material that was being submitted. As a person of color, I can attest to the fact that his reaction to slaves being considered an employee was handled much better than it probably would have been maybe from another parent of color. And although we know that not to be true, he still took the proper steps and followed the process. And I think that that's something that we can all learn from on both sides. As a mom of 4 children, 2 who are already in elementary school, you want to keep them in a bubble, and as long as you possibly can, I'm very open about that. However, I realize that the bubble that works for my house might not be the bubble that works for your house. And so I think it's important that we stick to what the policies are and just be very careful that we don't, I'm trying to think of a proper way to say this, but that we don't take some of our adult issues and make them our kids' issues. Because I think that how my kids are growing up looks very different from how I grew up. Coming from King Street and going to a school just demographically that was not diverse and only had a handful of kids that weren't Black. And then my kids don't have that because my friend group is diverse by nature. Their friend group is diverse, and we have challenging conversations, and they're not always comfortable. They sometimes ask me, why they might be the only person of color, in a camp that they're in or some other opportunity or whatever. And so I think when we have material that is challenging and thought-provoking, all we're doing is growing our children and preparing them for what America actually looks like. And I think that that's important. And I don't think that this is about, or it should not be about politics or any of those messy things. I think that if we just stick to the policy, and if we just think about collectively, the community and the board, just think collectively about what is most important for our children, we will be all right. That's all I'm going to say.
Thank you. I guess also to address your initial question, how do I feel about the current policies? I think that the policies are fine the way they are. The point of the policies and I just want to reiterate, we do not, somebody said it earlier, but we do not teach CRT. It's not part of our curriculum. That's not a concern. It's not a thing. The point of this is to prepare, to create a framework, a construct for the teachers to be able to teach lessons and also handle inquiries, and I think, and concerns about whatever it is, whether it's this or any other issue, and we have that in this policy. So no, I think we're fine. I don't recommend changing anything about that as far as our policies are concerned, and I agree with, keeping the overall goal in mind. We're trying to prepare our kids to compete in a national and global world. And we cannot do that by limiting what they're exposed to. And so we need to, I appreciate the lessons and the different opinions and viewpoints that are brought into the classroom here in this district and elsewhere that I was exposed to as a student. And it prepares our kids to compete, because they're going to, whether we like it or not or agree with it or not, they're going to have to compete in the world. And life is coming at them regardless of what we teach them. We better teach them to be ready to handle it and to be able to get along and get by alongside everyone that they're going to come up against and with. And Ms. Snipes, you touched on it. This, I think, reiterates the importance of keeping politics, especially out of a nonpartisan board operation. So.
I just wanted to, I don't think there's really any problems with the policy. There could be some things that could be expanded. My mother taught high school. She went on to teach college. My dad taught college. Everybody I knew taught. And I didn't understand when I got my first job that I only got 2 days at Christmas. It was quite a shock for me growing up. I love teachers. Teachers are what make our district great. I mean, if I could pick two things, it would be the parents and the teachers. The policy does, and it's something that people need to realize, and if you don't like it, the current policy, you need to make your voices heard, but it does give the community the right to communicate their concerns to the board. And board members then, by policy, communicate any concerns that come to us to the superintendent. A couple of things that, I do think that we ought to look at is incorporating the law. The budget proviso is a law right now. And I think we ought to look at selection of materials and relevance to the course. I think one of the things that's happened in our technical society is when I was a kid, everything was in the textbook, and that's why all the laws are written, and we have board votes on the textbooks. But the reality is that we have access to so many more materials now, and that's a good thing generally for kids. But the other problem is that those materials also aren't necessarily vetted, and I'm not so much talking about a book here as I am other things. Videos, websites, that kind of thing. And I'm also not talking about just issues of systemic racism or that kind of thing. I also have concerns about age appropriateness sexual content. So as a board member, I think these are good policies. They appear to be model policies. I've looked at other school districts, but I would like to see us look at selection of materials and relevance to the course and the law. And I'd like to see us develop professional development for our teachers so that they feel comfortable and they don't have to worry that what they're doing, they understand where this line is. When do I need to go to the principal and all of that versus when, because you should feel comfortable knowing that your lesson plans are within policy.
I want to kind of comment on something that you said, Ms. Huddle. You mentioned that the policies say that this does say that the parents can connect with the board. So what I read in this policy is that the community has rights to express, has a right to communicate concerns regarding these matters through the proper channels to the board. So what's frustrating to me as a board member, and it's not even just about this issue that's the CRT issue, it's any issue really, when someone contacts me about an issue, and they haven't even told the school about it, there isn't really anything that we can do, and then it muddles the water from like the very beginning. So what I think is important as we discuss these policies is, yes, the community absolutely should communicate with the board, but they should communicate in the right way. And if they haven't reached out to a teacher, and they haven't reached out to the principal, and they haven't reached out to the district office, and they come straight to us, and we're the ones that are, emailing Dr. Ross and saying, what happened here? And then it starts from the top down to figure out what actually happened. And then we still don't really know what happened because it's not our position. The administration can't just come to us and tell us what an investigation is or what actually happened. And I know that that is frustrating. Believe me, I have taken a lot of heat for that. It is very frustrating. But there is a proper way to handle a situation, and I think, if we leave this meeting with anything accomplished at all, I just want everyone, the community to know, parents to know, if something happens in a classroom that upsets you about your child, talk to the teacher. And if you don't feel comfortable talking to the teacher, then go to a principal. Because listen, I have kids, and if something happened that made my child feel uncomfortable, I would be down there that day. I would not email myself or, my counterpart or a board member, you go to the teacher and you find out what's happening. And I think that we've got these blinders on, and it is creating so much chaos for everyone, and it's unnecessary. The other thing that I would say that is frustrating about some of this, and you mentioned the proviso, and I've had conversations with several legislators, before any of this happened, and definitely in the last week. And that proviso that you're referring to, it came up on the fly on the floor. It wasn't really well thought out. There is no tie-in to what a district is actually supposed to do if something violates that proviso. It doesn't talk about the different sources of funding. It doesn't talk about what the action is that would happen to the teacher. That proviso does not mention the word student once. And it is frustrating because you're accused of breaking the law, a teacher's accused of breaking the law, and our policies are actually, most of our policies are rooted in legislation, in state law, statute. And we talked about, when we talked about supplemental materials on April 24th, we talked about that. There was a bill on the floor, we thought it would pass, it did not pass. That's one of the reasons why we haven't brought that back, because it didn't pass. So when we're talking about something that is novel, like that even the General Assembly hasn't been able to figure out, changing any of our policies makes me very nervous because it opens the district up to liability. And I don't want to give anybody the impression that board members have the ability to fire a teacher because it comes straight to them, because they don't. And that has nothing to do with my thoughts on any issue at all. It's just, there's a right way to do things and there's a wrong way to do things. I've said that 100 times, I feel like, this week. It's the truth. And so I do think, Mr. Scully mentioned, that you don't think that there's CRT or whatever. I hear that too. I have heard concerns about teachers maybe being overzealous and maybe not presenting two sides of a story, or making students feel a certain way. And that's where this all stems from. I think that there are some rogue folks out there they don't believe that there's more than one perspective on every issue. I'm not applying that to our district right now. I'm not talking about anybody specific. I'm just saying that happens. But the reason why this is so controversial is because there are a few folks that have opinions and that they only see one side. That is my opinion as me. But it's not, to me, there isn't anything that we can do. And I know I'm on a soapbox and I will try to step down. Mr. Satterfield.
As a retired principal, I have an opinion about all this. I remember when George Bush was running for president and he introduced something called No Child Left Behind. We all remember that. Those older folks can probably remember that. Politicians do this all the time. They do this. They do this all the time. It helps them get elected. It's very partisan. But the thing is, it's kind of like with this proviso. They're not responsible for implementing any of this. So what it does, it's very vague, but it sounds pleasing. There are groups like that. Moms for Liberty. Who wouldn't like that? Moms for Liberty. No child left behind. There's a lot of those things that they're just presented as such, that they sound really good. This proviso, just so you know, was a bill that was introduced that failed in the Senate and was interjected as a proviso in the finance area. I'd like to challenge anybody. Again, you know me, I'm a reader. I go back and check. Does anybody on this board know how many provisos were introduced or changed? You know that they're only good for a year. They're only good, it's a year. It's a proviso, a provision. So they have to be revisited or rewritten. Am I right, Ms. Hines? I know you're more affiliated with that.
Well, they can be renewed.
They can be renewed. A lot of them are deleted.
Renewed.
Which is all the more reason why you shouldn't change board policy on something that is a provision. But does anybody on this board want to take a guess at how many provisos or provisions from this year or last year regarding education specifically?
I'd say hundreds.
There were over 100 last year. There were over 50. Can anybody on this board name another proviso? Can you, Ms. Huddle? You might win the prize.
The step schedule is a proviso.
The step schedule, that's one. You got any more? You see, my point is this, and I hope it's well taken. This is something that folks who do have a political agenda have done to our schools. And like I say, with George Bush, it drove me crazy because they're not responsible for dealing with it. They throw it out there and they cause a lot of scramble and a lot of anger and frustration, and then they expect us to get together and solve this problem. They force people to change sides. And part of the proviso was as they, and I've got copies of both. I've got the bill, which does not read the same as the proviso, just so you know. But it was supposed to prevent division, and Lord, what has it done? But caused division. Now, the other thing I want to say is that we've talked a lot about board policy and about not changing. If we would just follow board policy. We are asking teachers to follow this policy. When I was a principal, that was one of the most frustrating things is when I would get a call from a board member. How am I getting a call from a board member? If a parent, it's very specific. While you're right, Ms. Huddle, they can contact board members. They can. But the board member should, knowing the policy, say, you need to talk to that teacher. I am not going to make a decision. I am not going to get on social media and make commentary about something before it's even handled or it's even been looked at. As a matter of fact, I'm supposed to be nonpartisan. The board policy says very specifically, we are nonpartisan. I don't care who elected me. Thank you for your, I'm not sure, thank you for your vote now. But I want you to know that I represent every child. Yes, you do. I don't care what religion, what race, what gender, identity, I don't care. I represent every child, every teacher. And the last thing that I want to say about this is, teachers, thank you for coming, not because I agree with you, although I do. I want you to know that this is your format. We are here to serve the community. You are an integral and immensely important part of this community. You determine the success of our schools. I know, I've been there. Mr. Funk, are you still here? Mr. Funk, I hired Mr. Funk, and I got a Heisman Trophy winner there. I'm very sorry that all this took place and you chose to leave this district. You should also know that when we go into executive session, we look at personnel issues. Right now, we have 40 certified openings. Is that correct, Dr. Ross? 40 certified vacancies. That is only going to increase every year. When we look at the contract or the contract status of those employees, huge amounts. I'm guessing probably 35 to 40% are LOAs. Does anybody know what an LOA is? LOA is something, a category given to teachers. That's called letter of agreement. Do you know why they're a letter of agreement? Because they are already eligible for retirement. So a huge number of our teachers are aged, I'm not sure the correct word. English teachers, you can correct me. But they are ready to retire. They can retire. So the worst thing we can do is to give them a reason to leave because we depend on these LOAs. We should be, and Dr. Ross and I have had this conversation many times, we should be doing everything we can do. I was an active recruiter as a principal, I'll be honest with you. I'd go outside the realms and recruit good teachers. That might be how I got Mr. Funk. But the point being is, this is getting very difficult. We've talked to other districts who are telling us that they are fighting to find ways to hire teachers. They're offering huge bonuses. They're talking about putting in teacher housing and daycare. We should be doing everything we can. I guess I know I'm on my soapbox, and thank you for giving me this time, Ms. Hines, but we should be doing everything we should do to retain and support and demonstrate. Stay off social media. Quit publicly criticizing. You're a board. We're supposed to operate as a unit. We can vote and have disagreements, but it sends a terrible message to those folks out there when we get on, and I don't care if you say I'm not speaking as a board member or not, you're a board member.
All right. Yes. All right. We're gonna stay on topic. I have just one question for Dr. Ross, and then I'll turn it over to you, Ms. Huddle. We've had several people make some comments, and it has actually made, it's part of like what has drawn, stirred the national media. I just want to know if there has been a book challenged or a book banned in this calendar school year.
No, ma'am, we have not banned a book this year.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Huddle.
I had a question for Mr. Satterfield. You said that we broke board policy. What board policy did we break, and who broke it?
Well, in my opinion, the first one we broke was not telling people to follow the board policy with regards to making a complaint. The second one is not to show any sense of partisanship. The third one is where it says we are not administrators, we are board members who establish policy, and we should know the difference.
I am going to stop this conversation because breaking the board policy, breaking board policy is not what we're here to discuss. We're here to discuss these two controversial materials. So that is a conversation for a later date. Do we have any other conversations relating to the two policies that we're discussing tonight?
I would just like to make the point that you may or may not like a budget proviso, but it is the law. The step schedule is in the budget proviso. We have an opportunity here to look at the budget proviso and put updates in our policy and train to that will ensure that we meet the law. And if you've read the budget proviso, I actually have a hard time understanding why anyone would have a problem with it. I'm just going to read it. The following, okay. I'm not going to read the entire thing, but the following concepts are prohibited. One race or sex is inherently superior to another race or sex. An individual, by virtue of his race or sex, is inherently racist, sexist, or oppressive, whether consciously or unconsciously. An individual should be discriminated against or receive adverse treatment solely or partly because of his race or sex. An individual's moral standing or worth is necessarily determined by his race or sex. An individual, by virtue of his race or sex, bears responsibility for actions committed in the past by other members of the same race or sex. And I'm not going to finish reading it because that's about half of it, but I encourage, and if you
Everybody feel that
disagree,
way?
if you disagree with it, it is the law. You go to your legislature, you go to your representative, but you know, as a school district, Ms. Hines, as a school district, we are required to uphold the law, just like we uphold the step schedule and adds even more to it. We are responsible for following this budget proviso as well, whether we like it or not.
Ms. Hines, can I say one last thing? And this is not a negative comment or anything towards Ms. Huddle. I do want to say, she is right. It is a budget proviso. You're correct. At the very least, tell the teachers. I mean, give them some professional development. Don't leave them in. I just told you there's over 150 provisos. We can't name them because we're not interested in all those. They're all very important. But before we attack a teacher, or any teachers, I know I don't want to cross about, before we attack teachers or say things negative about teachers, let's make sure that they've at least had the exposure to in the professional development. That's my point.
One thing, real quick though, and then I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Ross. Ms. Huddle, I'm not suggesting at all that we don't follow the law. I think that you're absolutely right. Those sentences that you just read, I mean, those are very important. It is the law. That's also touched on in the policy, maybe not as specifically. The reason why I don't think that we amend the policy for a proviso is because that's not a permanent law, and a policy is permanent. The problem with that proviso is that it suggests that we don't, the proviso as written says that funding from the State Department of Education cannot be used in furtherance to instruct, all of these other words that you have in front of you for all of those subjects that you just said, and then that's it. First of all, we get funding from several different sources. We are not, it does not talk about how a teacher is disciplined or any of those things. So if there is a complaint, there's still a policy, and there's still, actual law that talks about what the procedures are in the Teacher Employment and Dismissal Act on any type of discipline, any type of investigation, any of that. It doesn't get to us. I think that's what is so upsetting to me, is because it doesn't come straight to us. And that is the narrative that has gone out, is that it should come straight to us, and that if a teacher is violating one of those laws, then we need to do something. Well, the district may need to do something, but we still have to follow those procedures. And, I really feel like when we talk about amending policy or implementing a new policy, we need to make sure that we get it right so we don't get sued. That does not mean that I don't agree with that part of that proviso, or that, any board member does or doesn't agree. That's just how I see that. On that,
Ms. Hines.
I'm going to turn it to Dr. Ross. Okay.
Real quick, I just want to reiterate, and I completely echo and support your notion that we should not amend board policy based on a temporary proviso. And I also want to just clarify that our board policy was not violated by that situation. We were in compliance. And so just like I think it would, for the point of, don't amend policy that is permanent based on a proviso, I want to go back and touch on a previous issue on the credit rating.
That's not where we are. I'm sorry, that is not on this conversation.
Okay,
Sorry.
that's fine. We'll talk about it
We can talk
down
about it the
road,
next
but
time we have that on the agenda.
Similarly, with this policy, you don't, I would not recommend amending our board policy for temporary issues.
All right, and I'll let Dr. Ross close that out. Your turn.
Oh, thank you. At the end of every class, the teacher asks, "What have you learned today?" And so I think one of the things I can model is what I've learned. And there was a teacher from Nazareth who gave a speech on a mountainside. He said, "Blessed are the peacemakers." So I'll take the fault to make peace. Tomorrow we have kids. We have kids to work. We have teachers to hire. We have staff to train. We have buses to fuel. We have bus drivers to train. We have work to do. We have buildings to get ready. We got 17,500 students coming back, and I need my people. So I commit to working with our staff to teach how we use books like Between the World and Me, so there's no confusion. I commit to staff development to ensure that teachers know where their protections are. I commit to ensuring that that young lady who says she's never seen required reading from someone of color, that's no longer the case. I commit to providing a world of multiple viewpoints for all of our students. I commit to that even though it's not in the R policy, that we ask our principals to see if we've talked to the teacher first. Tomorrow the sun rises, and I got kids to prepare for tomorrow. I need us as a community together. If that takes the fault of the leader to assume these issues so that we can move forward, then that's on me. And so to this board, to the community, Madam Chair, these are the commitments we make, and we will follow up in subsequent meetings to show you our progress. And we thank you for that time.
Thank you, Dr. Ross. All right. That brings us to, thank you. That brings us to 21, discussion regarding board officers meeting being live streamed. This was a request from Ms. Huddle, so I will let you.
Yes, ma'am. I asked to talk about this because a lot of things, the rest of the board has really no idea what's going to come on the agenda until the Thursday before the meeting when we get the packet. And sometimes we don't get the packet till late Thursday or Friday. And I understand it's a lot of work to put it together. So that's no issue there. But I know in some of the board officer meetings have at least one or two attendees have been able to watch it, YouTube, or I don't know what tool was used. So nothing fancy, but I just think it would be helpful if we could watch the board, that officers meeting, so we would know and have a clue as to what's coming up on the future board meetings.
All right. I'm going to let Dr. Ross had some things to say. I am going to say there's been one time where we've live streamed, or we didn't even live stream. We had a virtual meeting with Ms. Snipes and Mr. Hogan because of unexpected work commitments where they couldn't be there and we didn't have time to reschedule that particular meeting on that day. Board policy actually doesn't even, I talk about board committees. That started a long time ago, where board officers met with the superintendent. It continued when I was, Matt and I and you joined the board, that continued, and we're continuing. I think it's important to have, the board officers talking to the, superintendent in tandem. I hear what you're saying about the not knowing about the agenda until the Thursday before. I know previously, there had been a conversation a couple of years ago about having the board secretary send out notes about what was happening on the agenda. I don't know if that's something that we want to discuss as well, later, what I will say is that the board agenda is fluid. So it changes based on circumstances, that the administration brings to the board officers. So we may talk about and set like a skeleton agenda, and things may be taken off or added on based off of what information is available. And it goes all the way up until that Wednesday or Thursday before a board meeting. And so, I just wanted to give those thoughts. And then regarding like the actual staff time and the resources used for that, that would be, Dr. Ross would need to answer.
One of the things I was just going to say for consideration, we don't pay our staff for the board meeting, so we thank them, but they're not getting paid right now. And so what we do is we flex their time. So whatever time they devote to board meetings, they get off tomorrow, but they'll tell you, they'll be here bright and early tomorrow because of the workload that's there. So I would wonder if there was some consideration for a budget for broadcasting if we go this direction, so that we tried low tech once, and the sound issues became a problem. So we got beat up by about that. So we want good quality productions, but I have to consider just the demands on them, that they do this on flex and comp time. We tell them in advance the days that they're doing this. When we pull them offline for a morning meeting or afternoon meeting, what we're doing is now we're taking a technology, a trainer, our data support. We're taking all of that offline again. And while it might not be long, that's going to be twice as much the workload. So if we're going to do it, I just want to do it right. We need to devote resources to digital broadcasting for that. So that's just my concern, advocating for the staff. They didn't say anything, so it's me, but again, there is no supplement for staying late. They do these meetings. We try to flex their time. They never even flex it. So I just say, if we're going to add that extra piece, let's put the resources around it.
All right, thank you, Dr. Ross. Ms. Snipes?
I know we're not doing motions, it's just discussion, but I just wanted to comment on your, that I guess y'all used to have like the minutes
We
go
talked
out.
about it. I think it happened a couple of times, but it wasn't like a regular.
I never thought about it, but I think that's a good idea, especially given Dr. Ross's comments about budget and the financial piece that would have to go into this. The meetings aren't that exciting. So I don't know if we're gonna use extra money for something, I don't know if that's where we wanna put it. And they're open, so anybody could come, in person. I appreciate that y'all accommodated, like when I was traveling from work and Matt had the last minute thing, but it was, in my opinion, kind of harder to do the officer meeting.
It was for us too.
Yeah, it was. It was more challenging, so I just wanted to say that.
Matt?
Ms. Huddle, I understand exactly where you're coming from with not really knowing exactly what's going to be on the agenda, so I do understand that. Would it help if, going forward, the draft agenda would be sent out to all of us? There's kind of a shell of what would be discussed, and obviously there's changes that Dr. Ross would make between that meeting and when it actually was published to us on Thursday, but at least it gives a basis of kind of what can be expected.
Yes, that would.
And that's something, I don't know.
And the other point I'd like to make is there's a way to do this that doesn't require anybody but us. Because we're not, during COVID, we all should have learned a lot about this. And I'm not suggesting that the other board members be able to speak. You can do a Google Meet, GoToMeeting, I don't know what all the platforms that the district has, but it shouldn't, if it requires another human being besides us, then we need to do a little IT homework on our own, or I'll show y'all how to do it. But low tech doesn't, but just the ability to watch would be nice, and without involving any extra district staff. If there's some reason we can't do that, then yes, a draft agenda would be nice.
I can
right.
make that commitment to go ahead and
send
send
out
out a
the
draft
draft
agenda,
agenda?
after these meetings, just where everybody gets it individually.
All right. Do I have a motion, do we have any other discussion relating to this? Do I have a motion for number 22?
I move that we adjourn the meeting at 10 o'clock.
Do I have a second? Mr.
Wait, discussion.
No discussion. Do we have any
privilege.
discussion on whether we should adjourn?
Just real quick. One, congratulations to our summer graduates. Two, Ms. McCaskill, thank you so much for your work at TRIDAC this summer. It was wonderful. You did an outstanding job.
All right, any more discussion? I'm gonna call for the vote. All in favor to adjourn? Aye, motion carries 7-0. Our meeting is adjourned. Our next meeting is August 7th, and it will be at the district office. The district office for the 7th. He's still here. Yep.